Here's what I want you to do. I want you to think in your mind of a time where you were ashamed. Right now, think of a time where you did something, you believed something, you said something, you acted in a particular way. Think in your mind when you were ashamed. I'll tell you my story. It's kind of silly, kind of dumb, but I remember this maybe being the most shameful thing I have ever experienced. Anybody grow up in church, right? Like you guys, like church people, right? And growing up in church, you do all the church things, right? My church, we met every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. My parents went out for like prayer visitation, so we'd get carried along together. But one of the things that I had to do growing up is that I had to go to children's choir, right? You guys remember children's choir? Listen, I love music, but I hated children's choir. I loathed everything about children's choir. I mean, I would rather do a million different things than just go Sunday afternoon, learn silly little songs, or I thought they were silly little songs, and then perform that in big church, right? I hated it. Well, there was one particular time when I was getting ready to do this performance, and the choir director told me, hey, we're doing this like big birthday theme kind of thing, and I had to go to like this party store and get those plastic party hats. You guys know what I'm talking about? They're kind of like these big top hats, plastic, cool little hats. Well, I told Mom, hey Mom, I need one of these for my performance. I need it. You need to go get it for me. And kept bugging her about it. Well, it comes Sunday afternoon. It's time for the performance, right? And I'm getting dressed up. I'm ready to go. It's like, hey Mom, I need my party hat. Where's it at? And like this just face of terror and shock hits Mom, right? You guys know the face that Mom makes when she forgets something, right? And like she never forgets it, but like this one time she forgets it, right? And you just know you're in bad luck. Well, Mom does what Mom does best, right? She's going to fix the problem. It was too late for her to go to store and get back and us get to church on time. So she was just going to make a hat for me, right? So she goes to the craft box, and she gets out her construction paper, her scissors, her stapler, and she starts making this hat. And what was supposed to be a top hat, right? Big bill around, top hat on the top, turns out to be looking more like, just like, you guys seen those pinwheel hats, right? They look like really big yarmulkes with like little pinwheel on top, and like just kind of sits right on top of your head. It was the ugliest, messiest hat in the entire world, right? And Mom puts it on my head, and I look like a dweeb, right? I'm not going to wear this, Mom. I'm not going to be seen in church like this. My friends are never going to see me like this. So you know what I do, right? As a good son, I take the hat with me. She drops me off at church. I say, hey, Mom, love you. Hat off into the trash, right? I just go without it. I'm not wearing that thing. I had too much pride, too much, right, self-image, or as a kid, like I will not be seen like that. I wouldn't speak of it. I wasn't going to let my friends see me like that. No, into the trash, never to talk about it again, right? Now that for me, as like an 8th grader or an 8-year-old, that was a shameful experience, right? Just this stupid little hat, right? And we've all had other types of shameful experience, right? Where we act in a certain way, you get found out, and you have shame over you, or you believe one thing, and someone has a differing opinion than you, and you feel shame for that belief, or you're excited about or passionate about this one area of your life, and someone just says, no, that's why do you do that? That's so dumb, right? And you feel shame, right? And the truth is, we, as Christians, more often than not, we're probably ashamed of the gospel, right? Well, all of us, we have probably felt some type of shame talking through, experiencing, proclaiming the gospel message. Now tonight, as we're gathered together, I'm not going to kind of heap shame and condemnation on us because of our own shamefulness of the gospel, right? Now, what I want us to do tonight is to simply open the scriptures as we begin this new series called Foundations, and we're going to begin with the gospel. We're going to begin with the gospel. The most famous, probably, verse in all of Scripture about the gospel is Romans 1:16. So if you've got a Bible, go ahead and open them up. Turn your Bibles on. Romans 1, chapter 16. Here's our main thought. Here's the main direction that we're going tonight. The foundation of the Christian life is the gospel of Jesus Christ. and we ought not to be ashamed of it. That's the main thought. That's the main push of tonight. That the foundation of the Christian life is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we ought not to be ashamed of it. So let's read the text together. Verse 16. Paul says this, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." It's been said that these verses are kind of Paul's thesis statement for the book of Romans, right? And really for his entire ministry. This is his thesis statement, right? You guys remember what a thesis statement is, right? In what is it called? Language arts, your literature class, right? Every paper that you write, you have to include this thesis statement. A thesis statement is your main point. It's your point that you are arguing for, that you're supporting. It is what your entire paper is about. Well, for Paul, this is his thesis statement. This is his life verse. It is the direction, it is the movement of his ministry. "I am not ashamed of the gospel," he says. Why? "For it is the power of God for salvation, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." For it says, "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as is written, the righteous shall live by faith." So Paul is saying the foundation of the Christian life is motivated and fueled by the gospel. So for our time together, in the next several weeks, we're going throughout this series. It's called Foundations. And really, this series is an opportunity for me to show you who I am as a pastor, where I want to lead us, the direction that we're going together. It's a good time for you guys to get to me to know you, you to know me, kind of figure out what our quirks are, right? How we operate together. Think of this series as Landis's core beliefs and core values of ministry. And for us tonight, the foundation of ministry, I believe, the foundation of everything in the Christian life, it is founded upon the gospel of Jesus Christ. So the gospel. You're going to hear me say that phrase, say that word over and over and over and over again. I will always, when given an opportunity to speak, we're drawing our attention back to the gospel. Or we are being motivated to do because of the gospel. As much as I'm able, I want to be a gospel-centered pastor and lead a gospel-centered ministry. So what is this gospel? Right? This is kind of a churchy word, isn't it? I mean, if you go up to your friends that aren't believers and say, "Hey, tell me what the gospel is," they might be able to stumble their way through it a little bit, but it's a really churchy word now. But in the first century, when Paul is writing these words, when the New Testament writers are developing this concept of gospel, they would have known exactly what it meant. See, for the first century reader, for the first century person, they knew this word gospel. And it really, in a lot of ways, it means an announcement of good news. Right? What is the gospel? It is an announcement of good news. Most basically, it was a military term that was used of a person who would go and witness the battle being taken place, right? They're living in the first century. Mass communication is not developed yet, so how do they know if their side is winning the war? How do they know if the battle is going well on their side? So it was a military term. A person would go out and they would view the battle taking place. And once a victory or a defeat had happened on their side, they would run back to their city. And these people would be in watchtowers. They'd be looking out, trying to find out, oh, man, okay, can I see the runner? Is he coming? Is he going to give us good news or is he going to give us bad news? So these people in the watchtowers, that they would be able to tell. They were so trained to tell by how the person was running if they had good news or if they had bad news. So if the guy was just kind of moping around and just kind of dragging his feet, the guy in the watchtower knew, bad news, we've lost the battle. But if homie was just getting it, right? His feet were just going as fast as he could, and there's dust flying everywhere. He knew immediately by the way the guy was running that we have good news. The victory has been won. We won the battle. So when the guys would see the runner running towards him, he knew it was good news. He would leave the watchtower and he would go proclaim in the city what? Gospel. An announcement of good news. A victory has been won. So that's what gospel means. So when the New Testament writers begin to write, Paul and the boys are doing ministry all around the world. They take this word gospel, this phrase that means an announcement of good news, a battle has been won, and they apply it to the person and the work of Jesus. And Paul says, I'm not ashamed of this good news. So there's three things in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, three things that Paul says the gospel is. So the first one is this. The gospel is God's power to save. The gospel is God's power to save. Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Now, underline that in your text. I am not ashamed of the gospel. We're going to come back to that at the end. Right now, we kind of have to skip over it because I want to lay a foundation as to why he's not ashamed. We'll come back to it at the end. He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Why? For it, what is it? The gospel. For the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. So the gospel is God's power to save. God's power to save. So let's begin to kind of fit these puzzle pieces together a bit. We said that the gospel, at its root meaning, its basic meaning, just simply means an announcement of good news. A battle has been won. So why do the New Testament writers apply that to Jesus? Why do they say that Jesus, his person, his work, is gospel, is good news? Well, first, to think in my mind, if we're going to understand good news, we have to understand first bad news, right? If I'm going to understand and feel the weight and the glory of the good news of Jesus, then I also have to understand why there may be bad news coming my way. In other words, if I do not feel the weight of the bad news, I'm never going to understand the joy of the good news that's declared. So what is this bad news? What is this bad news? Well, Paul says in Romans 3:23, what? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Now, maybe let's rephrase this a little bit into some modern lingo, right? How might we say it in our language? We would say it like this. Well, all of us have sinned. All of us have sinned. And we've fallen short of God's perfect standard. God has a standard. And that's perfection, right? Absolute moral perfection. Paul says we've all sinned. And because of our sin, we are unable to ascend to that level of perfection. Now what is sin? Sin is any type of disobedience towards God. Sin is kind of cosmic treason against God. It is the rebellion of the creature against the Creator. It's as if when we sin, we say, God, I really don't need you. God, I really don't agree with what you have to say in this area. I'm just going to go do my own thing. I'm just going to do what I feel is the right thing to do in this moment. God, I don't need you. I don't want you. I'm going to operate by myself. God, get out of my life. That's really what we do when we sin. And because we are sinners, because we sin, we can never live up to God's perfect standard. His righteousness, His glory. Paul goes on in the book of Romans and he says another thing. If this bad news continually gets worse. In Romans 6:23, what does he say? He says, for the wages of sin is what? Death. The wages of sin is death. Now that term wage in the text, it's another military term. It is the phrase in which a Roman soldier would be paid for his service. It's what the king would give his soldiers for their service. So Paul is kind of saying that there's a master, his name is sin. He is the king over your and my life, and what he is paying out to us, his soldiers, is death. That's bad news. That's bad news. It's not just death in this life, it's death eternally that we deserve. Do you feel the weight of this? That we, being created in God's image, created to know, to love, to worship our Creator God. Yet we have told our Creator, I don't need you, I'm going to go do it my own way. He says, okay, but you need to understand, by doing that, what you have earned is death and separation. This is bad news. Bad news. But luckily for us, the bad news doesn't have to have this final say in our lives. Luckily for us, the bad news, it doesn't stop there. There is good news for us. And Paul says that this good news, the gospel, what is it? It has the power of God to save. The power of God to save us. See, the good news is that there has been a battle fought. There has been a battle fought. And this battle was between Jesus and the problem of our sin and our death. The gospel is the announcement that Jesus has went to war on our behalf and he has beaten our enemy. It's called sin and judgment and death and separation. See, the good news of the gospel says that Jesus, he went to battle for us. And he secured in himself our victory. This is good news. That death and sin and judgment and wrath for our sin, it doesn't have the final say in our lives. Instead, we can receive good news. We can receive new life. See, for us, that when we place our faith and trust in Jesus, when we trust that Jesus has paid the penalty for our sin, Paul calls that salvation. It has the power to save us. In other words, that power, it's effectual. It creates something new. It creates something in us that we can't produce in ourselves. It's effectual. Creates in us new life. So the gospel is God's power to save. Secondly, look at verse 17. The gospel is God's righteousness revealed. It is God's righteousness revealed. Verse 17. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. So the gospel, not only is it God's power to save, but the gospel is also God's righteousness revealed. Now we come to another churchy word, right? Righteousness. Anybody use that word today? No. What does that mean? What does that mean? What does righteousness mean? What does it mean that God is righteous? I think for a very simplistic and a very good way to understand God's righteousness is to say that He is perfect. His perfection is seen. God being righteous means that in everything that He does, in all of His workings, in all of His doings, in all of His conduct, He is perfect. He's just. He does that which is right. Always. So how does the gospel, the message that Jesus has went to war for us and overcome our greatest enemy, death and separation, how does that show us God's perfection? It shows us who God is. See, God being holy and righteous and just, Him being perfect, we have to realize that I am not. We're not perfect, are we? We've messed up tons today. And God, being a holy and righteous God, He must punish what is sinful. Do you know that God is obligated to punish sin? He has to do it. See, I used to think that God was kind of like this really bad janitor that just kind of swept my sin underneath the rug and just ignored it, act like it's not there. I mean, you guys have done that at home, right? When it's chore time and like, I really don't want to bend down and clean up all that dirt, so what do? Underneath the refrigerator, right? Underneath the stove, right? Just get rid of it, or just take one or two big swipes with the broom and it just magically disappears. That's kind of how I thought God dealt with my sin. Hoping that God really wouldn't do what he said he would do. Hoping he would ignore it. But God doesn't operate like that. He cannot ignore sin. So on the one hand, there's a problem. Problem for all of us. On the one hand, we know that God is loving, he is merciful, he is kind, he is gracious. He created us in his image. He created us for a purpose to know him, to love him, and to worship him. So on the one hand, God wants to be in relationship with us. He wants to be close to us. He desires relationship. But on the other hand, he is holy, he is righteous, and he is just. And he is obligated to punish that which is sinful. He has to separate himself from sin. So he has to push us away. So God desires to be in relationship with us, but at the same time, he must separate himself from that which is sinful. So how can we become righteous? How can I become, and how can I go back to be with God in that relationship that I was created for? This is how God's righteousness, his perfection, is revealed in the gospel. The gospel shows us the righteousness of God. So how do we become in a right relationship with God now? Because we're sinners. How can God be in relationship with that which is sinful? It's because he looks at Jesus and he says, I'm going to choose Jesus' perfection over yours. I know you're imperfect. I know that you're a sinner, but I'm going to view you as being perfect. I'm going to declare you as being perfect, even though you are not. Imagine it this way. Let's just role play for a moment, because I know this wouldn't be true for you. Imagine you're taking a test. Okay? You're taking a test, and you're sitting in class, and sitting at your desk, and you didn't study for the test. Been there? Every test? You're going to have to change that. You're going to have to change that. So imagine you're sitting there at your desk. Teacher says, I just take out 5 pieces of notebook paper, and front and back, you got 3 hours to complete this question. I want you to describe the 3 different kinds of isotopes and their electromagnetic properties as they relate to one another. You got 3 hours, 6 pages. Fill them all up. Put your name on it, ready, set, go. How are you going to do on that test? So here's how this goes, right? You write your name on your piece of paper, and you stare at that sheet of paper for 3 hours. And it's one of those classes where you just can't write stuff because the teacher knows, right? And you just can't get yourself out of this one. So you just know, like, after 3 hours, you're like, well, I'm going to go up here, and this final exam, I guess I'm going to turn it in, and I'm going to fail the course. Because it's empty. I have nothing to write on this. I got nothing to offer here. And just about that time where you turn in your empty sheet of paper that you know you're going to fail the course with, the student shows up, and he takes your sheet of paper, and he scribbles out your name, and he writes his instead. And on his sheet of paper, he scribbles out his name and writes yours on there. Let's trade. I'll take your score and you take mine. How does that make you feel? In school, it's called cheating. Absolutely. You cannot do that in school. I've got time for this story. My best friend in high school, I talked to him yesterday. Like my only friend that I still talk to from high school. Listen, you guys are putting so much stock in your social status. Let me just tell you, you will never talk to your high school friends ever again. You'll have like 2 or 3 that you stay in contact with, right? Sad reality. So, here's what he did, okay? He's taking freshman biology as a senior, okay? Because he wasn't exactly I don't want to say he wasn't smart. School wasn't for him, right? We all know those people, right? He was taking like pre-algebra as a senior just because school was very difficult for him. So he was going to fail biology, and our friend Sammy Jo, she's really good, right? We're like really smart, straight A type of student. It's like, hey, let me have your project. I need to do it, right? This semester-long project that he's, waited the last minute to do, not going to get it done. It took the semester to complete it, and he's going to do it all in one night. Well, he gets to home and figures out there's not a chance. I can't even cheat my way through this one. So he goes to the library and makes photocopies of the entire thing. Doesn't even take her name off of it. Turns it in as his. Right? Listen, if you cheat, at least be smart about it. Right? Not good. Not good. But so let's go back to our illustration. You have nothing to offer the teacher. You're going to fail this course. You're going to fail this grade. You're going to retake it all because you are inadequate to give the solution to the problem, right? But this person comes up and says, hey, let's switch. You can have my A and I'll take your F. See, in a lot of ways, that's kind of what Jesus has done for us. It's as if Jesus has taken the test of our life and then switched out the names on it. It's as if Jesus lived the life that I could not live. He lived the life that I couldn't live, took his name off of it and put mine on it. He went to the cross and died the death that I deserved to die and switched names on it. So when we come to Jesus, listen, this is so important. This is so important to understand the gospel. When we come to Jesus, we come to him as we are, as sinners, separated from a relationship with him. And we come to Jesus and we say, Jesus, all I have to offer you is myself. He says, that's all I want. That's all I want. So he takes you as you are, sinful, broken, desiring, needing a changed life. And he takes your sinfulness, and in exchange for your sinfulness, you receive his perfection. And on the cross, Jesus exchanges his perfection, his innocence, for your guilt. There's a great exchange that happens at the cross of Christ. You get everything, and Jesus gets nothing. He gets your sin, he gets your condemnation, he gets your wrath, he gets your punishment, and you receive in that place salvation, new life, new beginnings, relationship with God that you were created to experience. So the gospel, it reveals the righteousness of God. And lastly, we see this. That the gospel is God's gift to be received by faith. The gospel is God's gift to be received by faith. Verse 17, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So the gospel not only is it God's power to save, not only is it God's righteousness revealed, but also it is a gift to be received by faith. See, faith is the currency that lays hold to the gospel message. Faith is what is displayed. It is the response of understanding the gospel of Jesus Christ. See, when we understand the gospel, it demands a response out of us. See, no one hears the gospel of Jesus Christ and is just neutral on the matter. No one's just like, whatever. See, Matt Chandler, one guy that I love to listen to, he says it this way: you are either moving closer to Jesus or you're being repelled further away from Jesus. Every time that you hear the gospel, you're either going to fall more in love with Jesus or you're going to take a step back away from Jesus. So it demands a response from us. And the response is this: response is this. How do you respond to the gospel? How do you respond? Paul says you receive it by faith. So the question we all have to answer tonight is this. Has there been a time in your life when you've received the gospel? Do you believe that Jesus lived his life for you, died on the cross for you, rose again for you? Do you believe that? Not trusting in your ability, not trusting in your status, not trusting in your morality, not trusting in your effort. Do you believe that Jesus did it all for you? He won that victory on that battlefield for you. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? Do you have faith in that? And then I want to end with this. I know for many of us, we raised our hand, yeah, I grew up in church. So for many, maybe all of you, you've heard this message before, right? You know the gospel. And already you're thinking to yourself like, why do I need to hear this again? Well, what's in this for me? Like, give me something new. Give me something different. What is there in this for me? And here's my answer to you. Everything. Everything depends on the gospel. Listen to me. Your ability to take that next step in your relationship with Jesus depends on your faith in Jesus. That you believe in Jesus right now. You're trusting in Jesus right now. Like your ability to overcome that sin in your life, it isn't motivated. It will not come to fruition through more effort, more I want to say effort again. It's not going to happen through any type of self. The ability for you to overcome sin in your life is motivated by the gospel of Jesus Christ. The ability for you to kind of conjure up all of the courage that is going to require of you to share the gospel with your friends, it doesn't happen from within. It happens because of your faith in Jesus. Listen, the fire to do in the Christian life is fueled by what Jesus has done for you. The gospel is not just for the sinner, it is also for the saint. It's not just for the lost, it's for the believer all the same. So everything that we do, everything, every event, every moment, every time we come to refuge, every time we meet in groups, every time we go to camp, it is always going to be motivated, it is going to be fueled by the gospel. Because I don't think any of the other stuff actually works. The gospel has to be our foundation. Simply put, the gospel of Jesus Christ is this, that Jesus came and he lived a perfect and sinless life on my behalf. He went to the cross and he died the death that I deserved to die. He arose again, securing in himself my new and eternal life with him. He has saved me from my sin and he has saved me for a purpose to join with him in a mission that brings redemption to the world. That's the gospel. That's the gospel. Do we believe it? And when we believe it, when God gives us eyes to see the beauty of the gospel and feet that are willing to walk wherever that gospel takes us, lives will change. Our lives will radically change. And that's what I'm praying for us as a student ministry. That we would look around and we would see each and every one of us consumed with Jesus. That I would understand the gospel deeply and I would feel it passionately. And it would motivate everything that we do. Everything that we do. So as we close our time together, the way I want to, we started doing this at my old church, and I really like it. So every time that we end a sermon, I'm going to put a phrase up here on the screen. And I want you to fill in the blank. Okay? Because the foundation of the Christian life is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we ought not to be ashamed of it, this week I will do what? Because the foundation of the Christian life is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we ought not to be ashamed of it, this week I will fill in the blank. In other words, what are you going to do with it? How will you become obedient to what the text tells us? Because while I love information, I love information like learning new things about the gospel, learning new things about the Bible, learning new things about God. Transformation of our hearts and our lives doesn't happen with us just acquiring new information. It happens, transformation happens when we apply the text. So how will we become obedient to the text this week? So this week, I will do that. I'm going to give you a minute to think about it. You write something down, and then I'll pray. We'll be dismissed to our groups. Father, the message of your gospel demands a response from all of us. Requires a response of faith and trust, surrender to you. That we be willing to lay our lives down for the sake of the gospel, that we do whatever it requires to get the message of the gospel out. Paul says that he was under obligation to share the gospel. He owed unbelievers the gospel. He was indebted to unbelievers to share the gospel. He said that he was eager to get to Rome to preach the gospel. So Jesus, would you create in our hearts, in our lives, an eagerness, a willingness, a desire to share your gospel? Because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. God, the reason that you sent the gospel to us is so that we could carry the gospel to someone else. The reason that you have called us to a relationship with you is so that we would be able to be equipped and empowered, sent out by your Holy Spirit to take the gospel to the nations. So help us to grow in our understanding of who you are, the grace and your mercy, the salvation that you've given us through your Son. Equip us, empower us to do whatever it takes to grow in our relationship with you. Give us big eyes, big hearts for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Help us to become obedient to whatever that demands of us. We ask that in your name. Amen.